Hi there, I'm Jake. I'm a park ranger here in the Blind Eternities. Today I want to talk about invasive species. That is, any new element brought into an environment that is non-native and has the potential to cause harm. Now, in a vacuum, these species aren't necessarily a problem, but in that specific environment where there are no natural predators, they can really get out of control. Now, I know when I say invasive species, most of you go to the same thought: slivers. But I want to get a little bit more general about it. I want to talk about specific cards, specific formats, or maybe even specific people that could be affecting your local experience in Magic the Gathering. And I want to talk about some of the mitigation strategies and resolution strategies that we can use in each of those cases. So now, let's talk about invasive species. So when we talk about invasive species from the perspective of specific cards, it's important to keep in mind that those cards represent a problem because of the environment in which they are placed. A lot of these cards that were just banned from Standard wouldn't be a problem in another format or even in another era of Standard. Right now, the format had gotten so centralized around this aggro archetype that you were either building that specific deck or building a deck specifically to counteract that deck. And that leads to an extremely unhealthy play pattern, and definitely got to the point where those cards needed to be removed. In a lot of these cases with invasive species, the easiest answer is to remove them from the environment. Now, there's a few other strategies that you can take, but for the most part, especially in a fairly short-term rotating format, it makes more sense to just clean house and make sure that the format stays balanced using bans and rotation. One of the alternatives that you can use is by introducing other powerful elements that can compete on the same level or slightly higher than the problematic species. This is the bringing in mongoose to fight the snake problem. Obviously, this can spiral out of control and lead to a lot of the issues that we see with power creep over time. There's a natural progression in card games like Magic the Gathering where cards get more powerful over time, but this is not an ideal solution to deal with discrete problematic aspects of the game. But I think there's another example of invasive species specifically looking at individual cards that can dramatically affect the environment in which they exist. And that's when you look at separate cohorts of people playing the game. One individual deck with a selection of added new powerful cards, whether that is proxy or bot, can dramatically shift the power level and the expected play patterns of that group. A couple easy Thassa's Oracle combos added to one deck can start an arms race that spirals across the entire rest of the playgroup until you are all playing near CEDH power level just to keep up with your own metagame. It's important to recognize when these shifts occur, what the invasive species are, and discuss as a group how you'd like to handle that. Is that the direction that you are interested in going? Is the solution to this invasive species to adjust the environment to meet this new card set, or revert the card set to meet the goals of that environment? There's not necessarily a wrong answer to this, but it's important to recognize when those invasive species exist, when they've been brought into a system, and open that discussion of how you'd like to resolve it. And to close this discussion of individual cards being brought into a specific environment, anytime you approach a new environment, whether that's a local game store or a new friend group, or just a few people that you randomly meet, it's important to have that first discussion about what the expectations of that environment are. What would be considered an invasive species there? Because similar to not wanting to bring something that is extremely overtuned to a given environment, showing up with something that is extremely underperforming is also going to lead to poor experiences on both sides. It's important to meet that environment where it is. Matching that power level, matching the energy, strategy, and style of play, and finding an environment that matches your expectations for that style of play is extremely important in Magic. One of the big notes on introducing invasive species is being careful where you carry these different elements from different environments to others, right? You don't move firewood from one place to another. You make sure you have nothing stuck to your boat if you're moving it into a new location. You check your pets for any insects or things that might have gotten stuck to them before you bring them into a new environment. If you're bringing new friends, give them the heads up on what style of Magic you like to play. If you're trying out a new LGS, talk to the people that play there frequently or the people that work there about what type of environment you're going to be entering. Just because your regular play group is fine with Chains of Mephistopheles, it might be worth scraping that barnacle off your boat before you dock it in a new harbor. But let's move on to discussing the formats in which we play, and not just the cards. So let's move on from the discussion of individual cards and talk about individual formats within a specific environment. Over the last couple decades of me playing Magic fairly regularly, I've seen this shift happen a couple of times. As new formats are brought into the local game shop, you see this bifurcation of the fan groups at that store. The first big split that I saw was when Modern was announced. Extended never really took off in the areas that I was playing. This was kind of standard plus. It was 4 or 5 years of a rotating format and allowed you to use a combination of cards from this standard and a couple standards past, building these interesting combination of decks, but more commonly just old standard decks that still held up fairly well in the Modern power levels. But with Modern officially being announced, the pool of cards that you could use were significantly bigger, and it inspired a lot of people to build some extremely efficient, powerful decks. This was also one of the first formats that launched with an extensive ban list. And as we saw people take up Modern and move out of Standard, it became a little bit confusing what you were playing. Multiple games involved asking your opponent if they wanted to get a game in and them not having the deck in the format that you wanted to play. Standard was no longer the standard in play. More recently, we saw this with Commander, and I think with the wide adoption of Commander precons being the de facto starting point for most people's Magic journey, I don't see that changing anytime soon. But when we see these splits and when these invasive species of new formats come to local game stores and come to local play groups, how should we respond? How do we want to deal with that friction? Obviously, we can take the same approach that they tend to take with standard cards that are a little bit outside the norm and simply eliminate them. We can say that we don't play that format here. Tiny leaders, not our style. This store does not support that. And in some cases, I think stores still do that. They say, sorry, we don't really host Modern Nights. It's just not a format that we have much people playing, many people that have interest in that, and so we stick primarily to Commander and Standard. Or maybe it goes the opposite direction, and they say, well, we don't really play Commander, we're more of a 60-card store here, and you can catch Standard, Modern, Legacy, whatever you got. We have different events throughout the week for those individual events. And you simply remove the pieces that are not interesting or not supported by the greater community at those stores. This has a couple of effects. You separate the different environments so people know what to expect when entering, which is generally a positive thing. But by that same token, the barrier to entry at different shops now becomes wildly diverse. And so new players that are interested in starting the game might find that the floor for buying into their local game store's main format is in the thousands of dollars, which can be very intimidating for a player who's just getting started. I think we can also take a couple of different approaches by trying to merge these things together, encouraging people to dabble in a lot of different formats, building casual versions of those format decks. There exist casual modern legal decks, casual standard legal decks. You can still build block constructed using cards only from Final Fantasy, if that's what you want to do. Ultimately, the invasive species of new formats happens so rarely that it's not a massive concern, and it's easy enough to try a couple things out, and if they work, bring them in, and if they don't, get rid of them. But what if it's not a format, not the rules itself, but the people? Because at the end of the day, Magic the Gathering is about the community. And I think in some cases you have invasive species of the human kind. So now let's talk about the hard conversations. And I know this sounds bad. Magic the Gathering should be an extremely welcoming community. And I think for the most part it is, but I am a huge proponent of playing the game with the right playgroup, finding the right people, the right environment, and the right play style that works for you. And occasionally you'll have a situation where your environment has new people join with a very different perspective on the game. The number one thing to keep in mind when new people are joining a regular playgroup or a local game store or any other Magic get-together is that those new players are interested in playing Magic. Now, they might be looking for a slightly different style of Magic, maybe more or less competitive than you're used to, or maybe a little less table talk or a little more table talk than is common at your local game store. But the game is the same. My local game store has a couple of different strategies for welcoming new people into the community. I think the first conversation that we always have is what power level they're interested in, what they're playing. And if they say they only have a pre-con and they're interested in playing pre-cons, that's really easy to facilitate. It's easy to get a group together that have pre-cons on hand, and they can all play at roughly the same power level and similar styles of game construction. Now, as the power level goes up, as people are looking for higher level brackets or more competitive attitudes, that can get a little bit fuzzy. One person's low 3 is another person's high 4. And aligning those definitions can be a little bit tricky. Like I said before, one of the things to keep in mind with invasive species is being aware of what you're bringing with you. If you're bringing a friend along to a Magic game night, probably pass along whatever information you have about that specific environment so they know what to expect. The shop might only play casual low-powered commander, and showing up with a full-on CEDH deck is gonna lead to a bad time for all parties involved. We're blessed with a local game store that has an extremely high ceiling on power levels available. And if you do show up to the shop and you bring a deck that's a little bit overtuned for the way that you're representing it, after a couple games, you're probably gonna find yourself sitting at a table with a lot of people that work for the shop that are swinging some really strong CEDH adjacent decks. And it's just the way that things work out, and it leads to a good gameplay experience because if someone's coming with that high power level of a deck, they're looking to play against other people with that high power level of a deck. And if they aren't looking for that experience of balanced play, they're probably not going to come back. It's a good way of policing the format over time. The more games someone plays, the more closely their win percentage should approach 25%. And if somebody's win percentage is being grossly overrepresented, it usually means that they are playing in the wrong environment. Simply shuffling people around until they're playing against balanced power levels doesn't always solve the problem. Again, people are looking for a specific gameplay experience, and in Commander, that can be fairly flexible. But in other formats, if you have a regular standard night, having the same person show up with a fully tuned powerhouse of a deck when everyone else is playing pretty casual Final Fantasy themed standard decks just gets old. And I think in those cases, it's important to adjust the environment itself. Or more specifically, split the environment. Have a couple of different standard events going. One with a prize pool and a more competitive line, and another that's more casual. Everybody gets a pack, $5 buy, easy peasy. Set up the conditions that allow everybody to experience Magic the way they want to experience it. If you have new people coming into your group that like playing a specific way, ask them if they're okay with you proxying up decks, meeting them on their level, finding a way to enjoy the game in a positive way. But at a local game store, there's only so much you can do. And if it does come down to it, if there really is a problem with the way that people are interacting, you eventually do have to have the hard conversation. Ultimately, there is no perfect solution. Everybody who plays Magic, every deck that's built, every strategy employed, every archetype that people enjoy matches up a little bit differently. And it's important to try to find the balance within that environment, but it's never going to line up exactly. So it's important to be aware of what people are looking for, what your local biome is within the scope of Magic the Gathering, and being able to recognize when an invasive species appears, whether that's a new deck, a new card, a new format, or a new player. And being able to have those open, honest conversations about what's going to make the game better and what's going to make the game worse. I think it makes it a better experience for all parties involved. And just by having those conversations, it's going to make people more aware of how they played the game and what experiences they're likely to have.